All right. Good morning, Kirk. How are you doing?
Oh, I think I'm doing wonderful, actually. Sun shining. I feel good. And the topic today is extra interesting. So,
You're right up
yeah,
your alley.
got a coffee here. No, where's that? Yeah, here it is.
There you go.
Double espresso right there. How could you not feel good?
Oh, well, your camera, just so everybody knows, we know that it's his real camera isn't working right. So he's not really going to be looking at the camera all the time. But
Not that there's much to see
No.
when you're looking at me, but
yeah. Yeah, so how's everything been? Sorry everyone for not doing last Thursday. It ran away on me. I was like triple booked, and yeah, and with me doing some traveling over the next few weeks here, I didn't want to just skip it. So we're doing a Monday episode, which it's Monday, so who knows what could happen.
yeah. Well, most of the people watch these after the fact anyway, so I don't think they'll be complaining too loudly.
All right. So we got Serpa here. Good morning, Serpa.
Hi, Serpa.
All right. And yeah, so don't forget, like, subscribe, hit the bell, and then you can get these last minute notices that we are going to be streaming. And don't forget to also leave comments. And yeah, if you want to talk to Kirk, just head over to kirkdurston.com and you can read some of his content there. So today we are going to be discussing a stream that Joe Rogan did with Bret Weinstein. Maybe if you can give a bit of a intro to Bret. I think everybody knows who Joe Rogan is, but
yeah. Well, Bret Weinstein is a evolutionary biologist who co-hosts a podcast called Dark Horse podcast, and it's usually focuses on issues in the area of science.
All right, and he would be known as a evolutionary.
Yeah, he's an evolutionary biologist who believes that Darwinism, or there's got to be a Darwinian explanation, but he's really quite honest about the state of where it is right now, and it's not that great.
All right, well let's get right into this. We're gonna sort of react as it happens. Kirk's seen a little bit of it, but I caught a few things that was like, hey, this is really good. And I don't think Kirk had seen it yet. So we will do a little bit of streaming here. And don't forget to comment if you have questions or if you see something that we don't. Leave us a comment. Mm-hmm. All right. So let's add Joe to the stage. So this is a little bit earlier in the conversation than you had linked to for me. But so just backing up a little bit, Tucker had somebody on and they were discussing evolution, and Tucker basically said, well, there's no macro evolution going on. There's all of micro evolution, no macro that we can see. And so basically Joe Rogan's asking Bret about that.
Mm-hmm. Believe in evolution as it's taught.
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, I went back and listened to it.
What did he exactly say?
He said a couple things. It was a little confusing. He said that, we see evidence of adaptation, but we don't see evidence of evolution, and that we've really gotten beyond the Darwinian model. We've essentially come to understand that it's not right.
This is essentially an argument for creationism?
It's an argument for intelligent design.
Okay.
I think. First of all, I want to clean up a little bit of what he said, just so it's.
That's an argument of intelligent design. It's not the argument. It's
not the main one. There's intuitive. There's ones that depends on our intuitions, our ability to see things and recognize, whoa, that looks designed and that doesn't. But it is subjective, and because it's based on intuition, it doesn't carry the same weight. But that weight has been growing. I think he's not just referring to an intuitive argument for intelligent design here, though. He's pointing out the failure, what appears to be the failure of a neo-Darwinian theory of common descent, that we've all descended from a single cell sometime in the past. He says we can't see it, we can't. Now, immediately somebody might say, well, of course we can't see it. This takes tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions to proceed. But the reason that it would take that long is because it's not guided by an intelligence. It's depending on things like genetic drift, mutations, insertions, deletions, just basically random processes. And every once in a while, those random processes hit something that looks like, hey, this would be an advantage. And because it really is an advantage, practically speaking, you can produce more progeny versus whatever we had before. But the problem is that when we accelerate this, and we can, now once you get an intelligent mind involved in your, say, selective breeding program at some university, you can actually change the evolutionary process from what is essentially a random walk to something that is guided, and you can speed up that process of macroevolution by many orders of magnitude. In other words, you're limited only now by the reproduction rate, how long a generation is. So for bacteria, you might be able to get them, say, in half an hour, you got your next generation. And so it's limited only by that. You're no longer dependent on random chance anymore. And you can take that and run with it. And every time we do, we hit a wall. It's not that we ran out of time for our experiment. We just hit a wall beyond which this is going nowhere. It's either further change will be lethal. It can't change any further because further change will be lethal to the organism. It just simply hits these walls and stands there. And this is a serious problem for neo-Darwinian theory, or let's just call it Darwinism, because a fundamental, central core prediction of Darwinism is that the variation that we observe within populations, and that's observable, and we observe natural selection, we observe mutation, we observe genetic drift. So we observe all the components of what we might call neo-Darwinian theory today. We observe all those components, but at the same time, we hit the brick wall. And so this is, the fundamental prediction is that this variation is not limited. There's no limits to this variation, which is kind of an obvious prediction if you're going to start with just a simple single cell with maybe 280 protein coding genes. And then from that simple cell, get everything you see in plant and animal life here today. Obviously, there has to be a lot of a real lack of limits for variation if you're going to get everything you see today out of single cells or simple cells.
So if it takes millions of years to go from one species to the next, and there's how many stages of species to get to humans according to neo-Darwinism?
Well, first of all, we have to be careful when we're the definition of a species is we just made it up.
How many jumps are we talking here?
Oh, you're talking like, say, to go from, let's say, a single cell to a human. You'll be talking millions of probably mutations. Well, I don't usually think in terms.
How old's the universe according to Darwinism?
They would say you got to start with the planet here because that's quite a bit younger than the universe. But they would say the planet would be roughly 4.5 billion. With you got to wait till it cools. So maybe you got about 4 billion years here.
So does even that little math line up, or do they say,
no.
Well, sometimes some of these jumps were like really, really fast?
You would have to, no, it doesn't. The more science advances, the more we see that Charles Darwin's nice, quaint story, and keep in mind, he published that before we knew virtually anything about genetics. There was a fellow named Bendel doing some experiments, and he became famous. But we didn't know anything about DNA, genes, protein, nothing about that. So when we knew nothing about the problem, it didn't seem that difficult to create a story about how one species gradually changes. Now, the word for species, you could usually refers to something that's reproductively kind of isolated from other organisms, so that it'll only reproduce with its own kind, so to speak. But that assumes a few things about our knowledge of the limits of species and so forth. I wouldn't go so far as to say one species could not evolve or vary into another subspecies that reproductively they're now isolated, even though genetically they might be identical. And I'm aware of one or two cases like that. However, when you start get big changes, we now know why we hit a wall. We know why we're hitting that wall, and every single experiment to date that falsifies the central prediction of Darwinism, which is the variation is not limited. We know why we're hitting a wall now, and it's because if you want to really move on to something different, a different kind of organism, or one level up, you're going to need, at the very least, some novel protein coding genes. That is, a gene that codes for a protein that has not yet been used in other life forms.
Okay,
and
so we'll get to this part later, because
sure.
Well, before we get there, let's hear what he says about the state of science right now in terms of evolution.
Interpretable.
Okay.
I don't really think he means we see the evidence for adaptation, but not evolution. That's not coherent. I think what he means is we see evidence for what we would call microevolution, but we don't see evidence for what we would call macroevolution. This is a commonly believed thing in intelligent design circles. And so microevolution, we would talk about the way a creature or a population of creatures would change relative to their environment. If the environment gets drier, those individuals who are more drought tolerant will outcompete the individuals that require more water, and so we'll see the population change over time. But he's saying we don't see evidence for macroevolution, which is the production of new species from old species.
A monkey becoming a person.
Yeah, we don't see big changes like that. Now, I don't want to bore your audience. I am concerned that the right way to address Tucker's challenge, and I as I said the last time I was on your show, when I heard him say it the first time, I reached out to him and I said, you really ought to let me talk to you about what's actually going on here. And he welcomed it. We still haven't sat down to do it, but nonetheless, he's open to hearing that he doesn't have it right, to his credit. But here's the problem. The correct response to Tucker, I do not believe involves what most people want me to do in response to something like what Tucker said.
What do you think that is? What do you think most people want?
I think people want the career evolutionary biologist to break out a bunch of examples from nature that make the case very, very clear so that they can relax. Tucker's concern isn't based in science, and they can go back to feeling comfortable that, the Darwinists have it well in hand.
I find this fascinating. If you don't believe that there is intelligence design, if you believe that it's what Darwin said it was, and it's starting to crumble a little bit, what does that mean for your future?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can see why people might be freaking out that, wait a second, like we need to solve this problem now. Yeah.
And what I want to point out, one thing that's also interesting here is that when you see people wanting, as Bret Weinstein is pointing out, now keep in mind, I should clarify here, Bret Weinstein I don't think, believes that intelligent design is the way to go, although we may see that he's actually, it is gaining a lot of ground. So just to be honest, representing him, but what I really appreciate about him is that he is honest. He talks about certain things that he would not be comfortable with doing where the average, say, Darwinist is. But when you want an answer before science has delivered that answer, what that tells you is that there's some fundamental underlying philosophical reasons that are motivating you, and it's not science. When you want science to comply with what you want so that you can, as he says, remain comfortable, then you have the possibility of the corruption of science, which he is pointing out to some degree here in what some of the more popular Darwinists are doing online. It's basically misrepresenting science to the audience so they can calm down, remain comfortable in their belief that everything happened naturally here. There's no ultimate, whatever. And that needs to be pointed.
It's almost like they need a lot of faith here, Kirk.
Well, it is. It does boil down. When you start to talk about philosophical goals and philosophical beliefs, faith. It's very difficult to prove anything 100%. So when you cannot prove something 100%, faith always steps in. Trust that the direction you're going is the right one. And for many people, there's some philosophical underpinnings here driving them to want to believe that there's a natural explanation to this. And that does require that they put their faith in something. And in this case, a lot of times it's science. But really what they put their faith in is the underlying philosophical viewpoints that they have that want science to give them the answer that they're looking for.
Well, it's not even science. It's the theory that they're basing their hope on. Because if it's not, like, science is only a method. It's not a religion. It's a... wait. Hold on.
Important point to make here. When you said it's not a religion, actually, Sheldon, there is something called scientism. And scientism is, you might not call it a religion, but you would certainly call it a philosophy.
It has all the elements of...
Yeah, it has all the elements of faith and so forth. But scientism is the fundamental presupposition that science explains everything. And you have to go deeper than that if you want and say, well, why would you, what would motivate you to do this? Because that itself is not a scientific conclusion. Rather, it's a philosophical perspective. As science would never say we explain everything. That would be very bad science.
It's all settled, Kirk. It's all settled. Let's continue on this video.
Okay.
And that's not where I am. I could do that, but I don't feel honorable doing that. I think,
good,
as a scientist, I should not be in the business of persuading people.
Kirk, can he do that? Are there a lot of examples of macroevolution?
Okay, so a couple of things here. Number one is when people attack evolution, they need to be a little more specific, and he kind of points this out when he distinguishes between micro and macro. Because if you're studying genetics, for example, evolution is just defined as variation of the population over time, and of course that happens.
But he's saying that he can prove macroevolution, and there are examples. He just doesn't want to go there.
Well, okay, the reason he doesn't want to go there is because I think he's going to basically admit that that constitutes data, but the data is itself is not sufficient to meet the expectations of what the people want. It's kind of, for example, I've got examples of this article, evolutionary biological articles, let's say in the origin of life, where a lot of what I call lack of data words are used, like probably, presumably, is conceivable, and so forth. So that's one way of doing it. And those are rhetorical methods to persuade people, not scientific, they're rhetorical. And that's part of what he's referring to here. He does not want to, he said the data should be strong enough to persuade people without me getting involved using rhetorical methods. But there's another problem. It's not just the data that supports your theory. Even more problematic is the data that falsifies your theory. And this is almost never talked about. Let's say I got a high school textbook from a local high school here.
Kirk, I'm going to interrupt you because we're never going to finish this video. But that might be a good future episode.
I want you to be persuaded. I want you to be persuaded by the facts. I want them to persuade you. But I don't think I'm allowed to persuade you. I think that it's a that it's effectively PR when I attempt to bring people over to Team Darwin. Further, as I'm sure I've mentioned to you before, I'm not happy with the state of Darwinism as it has been managed.
Just so you know, I did speed up his voice here.
I'm kind of annoyed by it. And although Tucker, I do not believe, is right in the end, there is a reason that the perspective that he was giving voice to is catching on in 2025. And it has to do with the fact that, in my opinion, the mainstream Darwinists are telling a kind of lie about how much we know and what remains to be understood. So by reporting that, yes, Darwinism is true and we know how it works, and people who aren't compelled by the story are illiterate or ignorant or whatever, they are pretending to know more than they do. So all that being said, let me say, I think modern Darwinism is broken. Yes, I do think I know more or less how to fix it. I'm annoyed at my colleagues for, I think, lying to themselves about the state of modern Darwinism. I think I know why that happened. I think they were concerned that a creationist worldview was always a threat, that it would reassert itself. And so they pretended that Darwinism was a more complete explanation.
Why is that such a concern? That's a rhetorical question. Okay.
As it was presented than it ever was.
What is wrong with Darwinism? Like, what do you think that Darwinism is doing itself a disservice by saying?
There are several different things that are wrong with it. The key one that I think is causing folks in intelligent design circles to begin to catch up is that the story we tell about how it is that mutation results in morphological change is incorrect. This is a very hard thing to convey, and I want to point out that if the explanation for creatures is Darwinian, that does not depend on anybody understanding it, and it does not depend on anybody being able to phrase it in a way that it's intuitive.
That's important, and he'll go into a little bit more here, but I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's just any fact or any truth. You don't necessarily need to be able to explain it or prove it. If it's true regardless of whether you're able to explain it or prove it.
Yeah. I mean, like, say, for example, my laptop computer here, it's got some electronics in here. Now, I've studied electronics, but what's in my laptop here is I can't explain it. I would just be, I can't. But it does not.
Resistors.
Yeah, transistors and microprocessors, all that kind of stuff. And when it gets down to telling you how much current is running through this versus that, and when, forget it. I found that bad enough when I was sitting in a lecture trying to solve microprocessor current, whatever. Yep. However, that doesn't mean my computer still works. Whether I understand it or not, it still works, and I can demonstrate that. The problem with Darwinism is that it's looking like when we try and demonstrate, like large scale, when we want to speed it up by orders of magnitude, it's not happening. It's not working. It's like saying, coming up with a pizza box, which is shaped like a laptop, and claiming that this thing can do, you can type on it and you can make all, and then opening the pizza box because people want a demonstration, and oops, this isn't working very well. And that's the problem.
All right, back to the video.
Okay, I think I could probably do a decent job on those fronts. But if you happened onto the Earth 100 million years ago, you would have found lots of animals running around, lots of plants growing. You would have recognized where you were and more or less what was going on. There's not a single creature on the planet that would have any idea what an abstract thought was. There would be no creature that had any inkling that there was even a question about where all this had come from. And Darwinism would still be the answer. So somehow, whether Darwinism is the answer does not depend on anybody knowing it or being able to explain it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the problem. Let's say that we went into the parking lot, and in one parking space, there's an excavator. And in the next parking space over is a Maserati. Now, let's say we took those two machines and we tore them apart so that we just had a stack of the compounds that they were made out of, right? The rubber, the vinyl, the various metals, all that stuff. There would be differences between the excavator and the Maserati, right? They would just be made of some different stuff. And then there'd be a lot of stuff that they had in common. Now, you could look at the differences in the materials that they're made out of, and you could say, well, the excavator is really good at, lifting materials and moving them around, and the Maserati is really good at going fast on a paved surface. And those differences are due to the differences in materials that they're made out of. That would be wrong. Probably you could take the list of materials that an excavator is made out of, and you could give it to a bunch of engineers, and you could say, I want you to make a Maserati, but you're limited to these materials. And they could do it. Wouldn't be quite as good, because there'd be some places where the ideal material wasn't available to them anymore. But there's no reason you couldn't make a Maserati out of the stuff.
Or a sports car.
Right.
Yeah.
So what that means is there are chemical differences between an excavator and a sports car, but they're not the story of the differences in what those two creatures do. The chemistry differences are incidental. Now, when we tell you that the differences that a bat became a flying mammal because it had a shrew-like ancestor, and that shrew-like ancestor had a genome spelled out in 3-letter codons. Those 3-letter codons specify amino acids, of which there are 20. And that the difference between the bat and the shrew is based in the differences in the proteins that are described by the genome.
We talked a lot about this in our Rock Rockets episode a few weeks ago. Those of you that didn't see that, go watch that. Kirk basically shows that I think what he's talking about now is pretty much impossible.
But it's nice to hear an evolutionary biologist from the other side of the fence explaining the same thing. Except
we are essentially saying that the difference.
You were going to say?
Yeah, except the question is, well, let's just finish hearing him out before I say anything.
And the shrew is a chemical difference. It's not a simple chemical difference the way it was when we were talking about excavators and sports cars, but nonetheless, it's a biochemical difference, right? The difference in the spelling of its proteins and structural proteins and enzymes and all of that stuff. I don't believe that mechanism is nearly powerful enough to explain how a shrew-like ancestor became a bat.
So what do you think is missing?
There's a whole layer.
Okay, is this something like as he goes into this layer? I don't know if did you see this part yet, Kirk?
I didn't see that part, but you told me a little bit about it ahead of time, and I really liked what you said.
Going up to this part where he's saying he doesn't think it's powerful enough.
No.
Is that a science? Is that commonly understood in science? This is not powerful enough. There needs to be something more, or is this what his issue is with the modern Darwinists?
That's part of his issue with the modern Darwinists, and I wouldn't say it's such a big issue in biology departments, because most of the time they're not really doing experiments and focusing on common descent or Darwinism. But it is a problem that an engineer picks up very rapidly. And his example of an excavator versus a Maserati is an engineer grasps that, hey, they've got the same raw materials here, but we're going to have to reconstitute, restructure. We got to have a plan. That's the problem. We got to have a plan so that we wind up with a Maserati instead of an excavator. And there's this higher layer of design space where you need some sort of an advanced plan, but it gets way worse than this. We'll just see what else he says here.
That is missing, that allows evolution to explore design space much more efficiently than the mechanism that we invoke.
And the mechanism we invoke is natural selection, adaptation,
the mechanism,
mutation.
That's the one.
Okay.
The mechanism that we invoke is
random mutation.
Random mutation, which I believe in. Random mutation happens. Selection, which chooses those variants that are produced by mutation and collects the ones that give the creature an advantage. There's nothing wrong with that story. That story is true. Okay? Random mutations happen. Selection collects the ones that are good, and those collected advantageous mutations accumulate in the genome. All of that is true. What I'm arguing against is the idea that transforms a shrew into a bat. What you need to get a shrew turned into a bat is a much less crude mechanism.
Okay, so what he's saying there is microevolution can depend on the random mutations.
Yep. Yep. And I think it's unfortunate that even the term evolution is used for variation. It's to me, it's just a rhetorical move, but it's been made for decades and decades to support Darwinism, when in fact variation would have been a more accurate word to use there. But there was an assumption that variation led to macroevolution, and therefore they thought it was legit to use that. Now we're saying, wait a sec, it doesn't seem legit at all to call that evolution, which is just horizontal variation, when in fact there's the vertical problem that doesn't seem to be reproducible at all.
Whereby selection, which is ancient at the point that you have shrews, explores design space, looking for ways to be that are yet undiscovered, more systematically than random chance.
Okay, so
that's a big one.
There's nothing. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'm probably wrong, but there's nothing in the tests and the research that's been done to say that there is a design space, is there?
Well, you got to kind of define design space, because it really depends what it is. There's different levels of design space. So there'd be a design space of, let's say, what sort of three-dimensional proteins are there out there that we can use? They're kind of like very complex Lego blocks to build stuff with. That's one level. And that might be the level of the excavator when you're looking at standardized parts between the Maserati and the excavator, like nuts and bolts. But there's another higher level of design space, and that is, we want an excavator or we want a Maserati. We don't want an excavator. So how do we go from this to that? And you have to have some sort of, normally, in fact, all the empirical evidence supports the idea that you're going to have a team of engineers on this problem. Intelligent engineers, very intelligent, to go from an excavator to a Maserati or vice versa. And this is what we call design space, this plan. We have to know where we're going. We can't just randomly start assembling parts. If we just randomly throw parts together and raw materials and stuff, you will never get a Maserati or anything resembling, even, you probably won't even get the excavator back out of that pile of stuff. So that's the problem. But let me just give you one specific example.
That helps explain my garage.
Yeah. Your garage and mine is an example of what happens when you don't have a plan in force that's maintained. But let me give you one example here. So we're all built out of what we call proteins, and there's thousands of different protein families, and you can essentially define a protein family as a group of proteins that all basically have the same three-dimensional structure, and that structure is determined by the sequence of the amino acids that he mentioned there, and that sequence is in turn determined by the information encoded in the genome or the DNA for that particular gene. Now let's back up a bit. This isn't a matter of fortuitously, after the fact, say, hey, we got these proteins, but if we started there, we'd have different proteins. We still have something that works and amazing. No, that's not how it works. Keep in mind that this three-dimensional structure is determined by the sequence, and that is determined, the structure is determined by physics, the laws of physics. So the moment the universe comes into existence, that moment, you also have the laws of physics coming into existence. And at that moment, long before, from an evolutionary perspective here, long before you ever have the first life form, all the sequences that will code for stable three-dimensional proteins are determined. And so you have this design space of three-dimensional proteins. Just imagine an ocean with islands sticking up here and there. And that's determined the instant the universe and the laws of physics come into existence.
Would Bret argue that too? Or would he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's one of the what did you call it? Dogmas of, or central teachings of protein science, is that sequence determines structure. Anfinsen was the scientist who basically discovered that. That's your fundamental sequence determines structure, and the sequence. There's only 20 different let's call them symbols, 20 different amino acids. So basically, that's is what you got to work with. 20 different amino acids, special kind. They all, but we don't get too technical here, but 20. And it's depending on how they're organized that'll determine the physical forces between them, which in turn determine their stable three-dimensional structure. And most sequences will not give you that. To be an example here, you will find, and this was my area of specialty when I did my PhD in biophysics. I looked at protein structure. How do we measure the information? How do we estimate that? What does it do in terms of three-dimensional structure? Here's the with the numbers I was getting, and since then that's been confirmed by 2 other scientific teams using different methods. We're all converging on the same rough ballpark figure here, but by and large, physics determines which sequences will give you these three-dimensional structures. On average, for an average protein, when he talks about searching design space, if you're going to do an evolutionary search, you've got to find an island that, let's say it was 1 meter square. You would have to sift through an ocean that's the size of 10 with 34 zeros after it, number of universes, before you found another island. That's how rare sequences that give you a stable three-dimensional fold are. In other words, most sequences, almost all of them will be junk. They won't give you any fitness advantage. They'll be lethal, actually, because you'll get misfolded proteins clumping together. They're so rare that you will never, ever, ever find a protein by the best supercomputers we have today, unless you cheat, of course, and that is you start feeding the supercomputers information about the laws of physics and chemistry, and then they can start building their own. That's an example of intelligent design in action. So the design space is enormous. The evolutionary processes are far too slow, far too. It's kind of like a computer that only does one process, let's say in the case of E. coli bacteria, every 30 minutes. Can you imagine if you had a computer running, so you don't measure it in megahertz or gigahertz or tera, you're measuring it in terms of one operation every 30 minutes, and that's basically a generation of bacteria. You're talking about like sending a bunch of chimpanzees with and saying and hoping they play around in that pile of rubble and build a Maserati. That's not that actually is an overly optimistic scenario, vastly over optimistic. So this design space, this plan for how to put together the amino acids, that's the lower level design space. And then once you got these three-dimensional Lego blocks, so to speak, how to build yourself a Maserati or an excavator, that's even a higher level plan. And as an engineer who was involved in experimental test aircraft engines, there's an enormous amount, there's millions of dollars spent, and dozens of engineers spent just to get the plan figured out, the bugs ironed out. And part of the problem, which we haven't really looked at, is these mutations, which he says basically is the driving force for change. But most mutations, at least in the protein coding areas, are going to be damaging. They're going to be negative. They're going to be deleterious. In fact, I got some numbers here. What was it? Roughly what? And the estimates vary. But for the protein coding regions here, let me just take a wee peek. It's going to be something like 75 to 85% of mutations will be harmful. That's in protein coding genes. 10 to 50%, you'll see there's overlap here in these estimates, will be neutral, and less than 1% are beneficial. So somehow you've got to go from an excavator to a Maserati, and you got this plan, you want to build the Maserati, but there's somebody messing things up, and they mess it up, let's say 70% of the time. They just randomly do something that messes you back, but only less than 1% of the time are you able to catch that mistake. And so the percentage of errors building up to get that Maserati or anything else at use is increasing by at least one order of magnitude. It's
so what I'm hearing is this explains politics. It's just a mess. It's just a mess.
I think for politics, you got to start bringing in human nature, not intelligence necessarily.
Well, that's what I mean. It's the negative part of all the problems. Okay, let's go back to Bret here for a little bit more.
And what would be that?
Well,
what is that force?
It's not a force.
What is that desire? What is that?
I believe there's a kind of information stored in genomes that is not in triplet codon form, that is much more of a type that would be familiar to a designer, either of machines or a programmer. That what we did was we took the random mutation model and we recognized that it was Darwinian, which it is, and we therefore assumed that it would explain anything that we could see that was clearly the product of Darwinian forces on the basis of those random mutations. And we skipped the layer in between, in which selection has a different kind of information stored in the genome that is not triplet codon in nature. So
there's an information stored in the genome that is motivating it to seek new forms?
No, not motivating, allowing it.
Allowing it.
Allowing.
So what's the motivation to seek new forms?
Oh, the motivation was there. It's primordial.
Right.
So the point is, let me try by analogy.
Okay.
Darwinists will tell you that evolution cannot look forward. It can only look backward. And there's a way in which that's just simply true. On the other hand, a Darwinist will also tell you that you are a product of evolution and you can look forward. Right? So if evolution can't look forward, but it can build a creature that can, then can evolution look forward? I think it effectively can. So my point is that random mutation mechanism is in a race to produce new forms that are better adapted to the world than their ancestors.
Is there a brain behind or a mind behind this? Like, he's saying it's in a race. It's like, well, why? What's assuming what he's saying is true? Why would there be a race? Oh, I can't hear you, Kirk. You're muted.
Okay, I found my cursor. That's the problem with having too many screens. You forget what screen is my cursor on. Yeah, there are different types of races going on here. One simple example to understand would be there's a scientist in the US that will knock out a gene with maybe just one mutation and then see how long it takes to, just by random mutation selection, to get back into operation again. They don't knock two out in the same gene and so forth. Well, what he finds is that when I mentioned there's damaging mutations, so let's say you knock out you mutate two amino acids in a particular gene. Remember, that's what you've done, is you've changed the information. Note that he's using the term information here. Just as an aside, there is only one thing that science has ever observed in a repeatable, reproducible way that can create significant levels of information, and that is intelligence. That's all science has, that's actually reproducible and testable and so forth. So, but in this case, in the experiment, we're not using intelligence. When that scientist mutates one amino acid, the gene no longer works, and he finds that after a certain number of generations, it's back up running again, because that one there, where the mistake was, accidentally got mutated back to what it should be, and that happened before the damaging mutations damaged the gene so badly that even if you mutated that one back, there's now 3 other errors to fix. So what he found is that you get two, virtually impossible for it to get fixed before the damage incurred elsewhere is so great that even if you do fix those 2 mutations, there's now 5 or 6 other ones that are now, in other words, the rate of damages is increasing faster than the repairs. And the only way around it is have enough going on that one accidentally gets repaired before it gets so badly damaged it won't work anymore. And the moment it works, it cuts in and it confers a real good fitness advantage to the organism, because it really needed that gene that got temporarily shut down, and then it can replenish the population. So there is a race in that sense. I am not sure that's the kind. Well, I'm not sure what else you'd be talking about a race. There's basically damage that's happening faster than beneficial mutations, way faster, probably 50 to 60 times faster.
Game. It can enhance its own ability to search, right? If you lose your keys, You don't search randomly, right? You go through a systematic process of search, and that systematic process of search results in you finding your keys sooner than you would otherwise. So,
okay, so I'm sorry to stop it on this one, but it's like, okay, but that's because my mind is logic.
That's an intelligent way to find your keys. You don't do it randomly. You do it systematically. The only the main resource that Darwinists would appeal to for a non-random process here is basically natural selection, or the fitness advantage that's so strong that it begins to occupy more than its share of the population, and therefore pass its genes on more often than the other competitors within the population. So that's where it becomes the direction it's going to go is non-random. In other words, if there's a real fitness advantage over here, let's say you repair that gene, then it's definitely going to go in that direction. That's not going to be, but the problem is the mutation itself, the methodology there is random. You're just going to have to wait until that gene is repaired accidentally before the damage where it's getting destroyed accidentally is too far gone to actual repair. It's kind of like trying to repair a Maserati while 3 other guys are working on it with sledgehammers, and you got to hurry up with your repair because they don't stop with their sledgehammers until you've got the repair done. But thank goodness if you have 100 million Maseratis and you got teams working on all of them, one of them might get repaired before the 3-team sledgehammer crew renders the thing so badly damaged, even the repair is not going to help anymore.
And then obviously that Maserati will take over all of the other millions that have been...
It'll beat them in a race, that's for sure. And if that's the defining factor, the other ones are just going to keep sitting there. So the one that gets repaired.
There's all these other ones in the way. All right, let's keep going.
We should expect evolution to find every trick it can access to increase the rate at which it discovers forms that would be useful in the habitat.
Why? Why can we expect that?
Well, I mean, one thing I don't like about what he's saying here. What?
It's in its best interest?
Well, you see, he's using design language here, and that is a problem in Darwinism, is that it appears so obviously designed, and some Darwinists will say, yeah, we use this design language way too much. And it actually confuses the discussion here. Like when he says evolution will find, basically, you just got to look at evolution. Let's call it variation and selection and mutation and stuff. You just got to look at it as a physical system that's mindless. And it's not going to necessarily find every trick in the book. It's not, and especially if those tricks are so rare that you need 10 to the 35th power of universes to find just one. So I think basically you can model it using a genetic algorithm where there's might be a lot of solutions, and in a simple problem you might find all of the more impressive solutions. You might find that, and you didn't. Where the intelligent design comes in there is in your fitness function within that program. You've got to carefully write your program so it's actually going to find whatever it is you want it to find. And so there's a certain amount of, you call it cheating, but it's not really cheating. It's just design, intelligent design in your genetic algorithms.
Okay.
And this is simply that. I'm not really saying anything that extraordinary, right? If I say, do you know that computers, all they do is binary? Well, that's true. But if you then imagine that means that the people who program computers do it in binary, well, there was a time when that was true. But it's not true anymore. It's not how you do it. There's a much more efficient way to program a computer, and it involves a programming language, which a computer itself can't understand. But you can build a computer that can either interpret the language in real time, or you can build a computer that can accept the code as it's spit out by a compiler.
Can we stop there?
Mechanisms to radically.
Okay, again, there's an awful lot. Oh, let me say one thing. There was a paper published by Trevor and Abels back around early 2000s that showed that the kind of information, or they didn't call it information, they called it functional complexity. We only find that in 3 places. And I happen to know one of those authors is an atheist and not a proponent of intelligent design, but he also believes Darwinism is a failed theory. But in that paper, they showed that basically there's only 3 places we find functional complexity or information. And that is human languages, programming languages, and the information encoded in DNA. And so we know that the first two, and so everything he's talking about is computer analogy, is examples of intelligent design in action. All this computer stuff and how we program computer. That's intelligent. That all is mind driven. Nobody writes computer code by just generating random things. Now, that being said, you can write carefully designed genetic algorithms, computer code to write code, but that again is intelligent design in action with the production. But bottom line is, the question is, this third stuff, this information encoded in DNA, the first two we know come from minds. The third looks awful like it. In fact, this information in DNA is far superior, far more advanced than anything humans have ever been able to design yet. And so, if anything, it is even further. It needs a super intelligence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, as he's talking about, okay, yeah, humans can write. I'm a computer programmer. I understand how that works, but in evolution, it's if you get it wrong, it explodes.
Well, if you have enough samples, enough kicks at the can, so to speak.
Don't forget, it all started with one.
Yeah, well, that one thing is so wildly improbable. There's another evolutionary biologist by Eugene Koonin. He says you will need, and he's definitely against intelligent design. In his paper, they actually discuss there's already only two options here. Definitely, we don't want ID, and you'll see that he closes his thing with that. But his solution is an infinite number of universes. And there's a problem when you start appealing to an infinite number of unseen, untestable entities in order to avoid one kind of, there's a mind behind the universe, just one mind, or an infinite number of unseen. And that doesn't even solve the problem, because you got to then focus on, well, where does this infinite number of universes come from? Because we know, this is a different topic, but we know from properties of countable infinite sets that has a beginning too, if in fact there's a sequence that has to unfold between parent universes and whatever.
Let's go a little bit more with him, and then I want to wrap it up here.
Increase the effectiveness of a programmer, but it all comes out binary anyway.
Right.
In the end, so that's really what I'm arguing, is that there's the initial layer of Darwinian stuff, the random mutation layer that it looks like what we teach people. There's another layer which we're not well familiar with, and it results in a much more powerful capacity to adapt than we can explain with that first mechanism, which is why guys like Tucker think there's just something. These Darwinists, they keep telling me that the shrew becomes a bat, and then they go on this rant about the random mutations and the triplet codons and the mutations that actually turn out to be good. It's just not powerful enough, and they're not wrong. They're detecting something real. And frankly, Tucker is the layperson example of this. You've had Stephen Meyer on. He's a scientist who's quite good, and he's spotted that the mechanism in question isn't powerful enough to explain the phenomena that we swear it explains. And so he's catching up. But that's really on the Darwinists for not admitting what they can't yet explain and pursuing it, which is what they should be doing.
What do you think that force is?
It's not a force. So
It can't be a force, because then we have to explain that.
Well, I have to laugh when he says the scientists who are favoring ID are catching up. No, it's the other way around. It's what I really appreciate about Bret Weinstein here is that he's actually thinking through this issue. He sees there's another layer that's needed there, and the other layer he refers to is what Stephen Meyer talks about, and that is information. There's information encoded in the genomes that tells you when to turn certain genes on and off and so forth, such that you can build these organisms. And that's the higher level information. And he's seeing this. Weinstein has seen this, but the problem is what produces information? What is it out there that can do this? And as he points out, it's not mutation and genetic drift and stuff. If you want to accidentally produce this information, you've got the 10 to the 35th universe problem, or in Koonin's case, to get RNA replication, you've got an infinite number of universes required. And that is not scientific.
Okay, but let's give them there was an infinite number of universes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just give them that.
Yeah. Okay.
We're on this one. So on this one, what had to happen was Big Bang on this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's a Big Bang on this universe that has the laws of physics that have written into the genes some information to say, here's how you evolve. And that would have to be on every strand of proteins that happen to be able to be perfectly matched to create life, which we looked at a few weeks ago. That has to then end up in the perfect swamp.
Yeah.
Because it has to be the perfect temperature, perfect everything. That then has to breed immediately. Otherwise, it has to start over. And in another swamp somewhere, another one just has to breed perfectly and split. And then you've got two.
Yeah.
And those then immediately need to split again.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
but not perfectly. You want mistakes introduced according to Darwinism so that you can accidentally start getting variation. And
but if you only have two, they have to be perfect or one will die. And
well, yeah, they have to be good enough to reproduce. And that's another problem we didn't even talk about, is that as the mutational load builds up in a population, the number of the percentage of progeny that will actually survive becomes lower and lower and lower until extinction. And so there's this constant, relentless force. We call it evolution because often they'll talk about mutation, or the what do you call it? Speed of mutation rate. They will refer to that as evolution in a lot of papers. And so you can talk about that actually destroys biological life. It doesn't create it, because for the simple fact that it introduces more mistakes than and improvements. And many of the improvements, if you look those up, if you actually say get on ChatGPT and start asking for where examples of beneficial mutations, are actually examples where information is destroyed. A certain gene is shut down, for example, that was causing a problem, or in that environment was consuming too much of whatever that was very limited. So it's a nightmare situation. And I think Bret Weinstein is starting to appreciate this higher level, but not the degree of difficulty. Maybe he secretly is. I've had many biology professors tell me in the privacy of their own office that in various ways that they think Darwinism is a failed theory because it just does not explain. Bottom line, the digital information encoded in DNA that seems to know what the lucky sequences are that were established at the moment of the Big Bang, the origin of the laws of physics, whatever. It already knows those things as programmed. There's nothing in nature. In fact, physics works against you because physics wants to do the same thing all the time. The laws of physics don't change. So they want to produce repeatable patterns, not random patterns. And random patterns don't help you either. It's just gibberish. So somewhere you've got to have a mix of randomness in order to encode information for proteins, and then how to build the Maserati.
So I just want to wrap my mind around this.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying now that, okay, there is this physical side of the gene where the 20 proteins need to line up perfectly. Right?
Amino acids, yeah.
Amino acids to create one single protein.
Mm-hmm.
How many proteins in that single cell organism?
Oh, they're thinking of maybe 280 proteins for a minimal genome. 280.
And those 280 are different, right? They're not.
Oh yeah, they're different ones. Yeah, you have to win the lottery.
Well, you have to win a lot of. You have to basically create the lottery. So you have to create this single cell organism that has to land in the perfect spot, all at the exact same time.
Yep.
And so where is the information needed to know to split?
Well, that has to be already built or designed into the genome, so it does have
Into
a splitting
all the
reproduction.
it would need to be built into all of them, right?
Yeah. So it's
And
kind of a chicken the egg problem.
And then you
But
have to have the, not only do we need to keep splitting, but for what Bret is saying is there's now a design space not only to split, but to improve.
Yeah, see, splitting just reproduces the same thing again, for, let's say, for a single cell. But the design space is kind of like, well, where could we go with this? Except, of course, nature doesn't think. It's not thinking. But there does seem to be a plan required to build any particular organism. And
So,
not only
like,
that,
I'm going to interrupt again because there needs to be like an IKEA manual for the genomes that cannot think at this point to do something, and that needs to happen millions and millions of times.
yeah.
Where's the next manual coming from?
It's really quite interesting because they're literally
purely natural.
Yeah, it is supposed to be
design space, and you've only got 280 genomes or 280 proteins
coding genes. Yeah,
in this simple organism, and there's enough information in there magically to tell it to split and improve.
Mm-hmm.
How does the manual create a human in this? We're in the design space. Where's the manual to create the human?
That's the problem. I mean, that's the problem. When you actually start thinking about this, you start to realize that this is getting beyond ridiculous. Normally, science doesn't work with events that have probabilities such that you're going to require an infinite number of universes, or even 10 to the 35th power universe. Science normally in science, that's equated to zero. There's zero chance of getting life. End of discussion. But the big philosophical underpinning is scientism, and people, for whatever reason, desperately want there not to be a designer behind the origin of nature itself and then life. They at all costs, they will be prepared to do this. And I think Bret Weinstein is at least calling that out. He's saying they're effectively lying, telling a lie. The Darwinists are, even though he would say he's at least pointing this out, and he's acknowledging there's a higher level plan. What he doesn't really explain yet, and to be fair, maybe he didn't have time, but just how improbable this plan is going to be, because that's the real problem. I'm prepared for this in many arguments and discussions. I'm prepared to grant the existence of amino acids, which is, they're even still trying to figure that out. It's kind of like, you got this information to build a Maserati and it's all on the CD, but first of all, you got to come up with a natural explanation as to how you got the CD. And that's the stage they're at.
How it's read.
And the reader. Yeah, you've got that, the ribosome that translates the RNA strand, which is transcribed from the information encoded in the gene. That ribosome is a machine, molecular nanomachine, that is jaw-dropping. It makes anything humans have engineered look crude, cavemanish by comparison. It has to read this string, and it goes through very quickly and assembles the protein in the basis of the information encoded in the RNA strand that's being fed through this machine. And the machine itself is made out of quite a few different proteins. Ribosomal 7, 10, there's a bunch of proteins, think of the complex, that have to be assembled just to read what the information coded in DNA. And those, unfortunately, you need those before the DNA is even going to do anything. So it is an enormous problem, but I'm prepared to grant that. I would say, even if we grant the first life form, just take it as a freebie, you will never get anything beyond what you initially start off with. You'll get a lot of variation. I think the Lenski experiment demonstrated that, because they want to see where's this going to go if we'll evolve it over 60,000 generations. But it didn't go anywhere. In fact, it lost information compared to what it had when it started. So that's the problem.
Basically, we're at what Serp is saying. Creation and evolution both require faith. Evolution has never been seen or proven. The world prefers evolution, so they do not have to respond to a righteous and just God.
Well, I think that's the philosophical underpinning behind a motivation, that we just want the freedom to do whatever we want without any moral accountability. I suspect that's it. No, I'm quite sure Bret Weinstein would beg to differ, and he'd come up with some other reason why, but it's still closely related to scientism.
I wanted to show one thing because it made me laugh. Where are we here? So in building the thumbnail, I went over to, I have a paid version of Midjourney. So AI image generator, one of the best. And I fed it a prompt. So this is using the world's information. Okay. I want an illustration of evolution from a single cell to a human. And I made it easy in 4 stages. This is what it gave me.
That's all you asked was just how the.
So I was expecting like a little dot on one corner, and then maybe like a bird and a monkey and a human,
looks
right?
Like a tree, yeah.
So I get this. So we got half a brain that looks like it's coming out of looks like there's some tree there. It looks like that's a wooden person. Even AI can't figure this out.
Well, that is actually quite interesting from a philosophical perspective. I know that some of the Darwinists will be screaming, but I think the Darwinists who are screaming really need to pay attention to what Bret is saying and need to start thinking more deeply about this. And if AI comes up with that explanation,
this is a paid version of AI.
Yeah, and believe me, there's a lot more, let's say, design built into Midjourney than there is into nature. Well, I would say into the laws of physics. Laws of physics are simple. They just do simple things. They just keep things under control. They don't build complex things. They don't produce massive anomalies. That's what a life form is a massive anomaly in the natural physical system. It's so improbable you'll need an infinite number of universes to explain that anomaly, or an intelligent mind, one of the two. Mm-hmm. Occam's razor says go with an intelligent mind behind nature and the origin and diversity of life.
All right. Well, thank you, Kirk, for helping me understand what Bret's been saying here. And don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell to be notified. And those of you who are watching this after and you have, no, you guys are completely wrong. I probably am. I am not trained in this at all. But Kirk is actually, what's the thing again that you have?
PhD in biophysics, specializing in protein structure and the information required to encode proteins.
And this is not at a Bible school, right? You got this.
No, and I didn't purchase it a mail order from Russia either. Yeah. From Russia. No, I actually it's from the University of Guelph, and I chose that area because I was specifically really interested in this problem that Bret Weinstein is talking about. You've got to isolate it. You reduce your problem down. Let's just worry about proteins. Right there, you've run up against a massive wall that would require minimum 10 to the 35 universes, or an infinite number, depending on whether you want Eugene Koonen's approach or whatever.
And then you get a problem where the universes come from.
Well, and there's that too. Or you can say there's an intelligence behind the protein, and the kind of information you need is the level we can produce all the time. We do it every time we write a one-page essay or email. That level of information is what's required to properly sequence amino acids. Although knowing the sequence, that's right now still, we're working, it's a reverse engineering project, a giant reverse engineering project, just to understand this well enough to be able to write sequences.
But obviously, a Big Bang would allow that to be written into.
You're obviously speaking, what do you call it, sarcastically, because not a chance.
Maybe. All right.
There's problems with that too. Maybe we'll have to discuss that sometime. The lack of gravity
I'm just
waves,
into
dark
like,
matter.
how do we just keep remembering to breathe? That to
Thank
me,
goodness. Yeah.
that
Thank
to me,
goodness, that's a brain, and that itself is a massive, interesting thing.
where'd that
Just
come
remember-
from? Like,
Well-
what told the brain in those initial things?
Oh yeah.
You need to do this by instinct. Like, yeah. Anyways,
From an engineering perspective, Sheldon, if all the evolutionary biologists got a degree in engineering first, Darwinism would have been dustbin of pseudoscience decades ago.
and replaced with.
Well, I hate to say it, but the fingerprints of an intelligent mind are all over the genomes of life in terms of the level of information encoded in there. It takes a mind to write code. We already know that. It takes a mind to write code. We're just reluctant to admit that.
And that goes back to what Serpa said. So, yeah, again, head over to kirkdurston.com. He's got lots of stuff on there.
Sure.
If you have anything you'd like us to talk about, react to, whatever, just hit that in the comments or let Kirk know. I'm gone for a few weeks here, going to a little country overseas called Japan. And I'll enjoy that for a few minutes and then back down to our very hostile neighbors to the south, those Americans. All right.
Prepare to pay some tariffs when you get back.
Hopefully we'll be allowed.
We're imposing on them. Like I read, that's a whole other subject. Like, why punish me by charging for the stuff we import? But that's don't want to get into that.
All right. Okay. We'll talk to you later, Kirk.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone.
Okay, bye.
All right.